What is 5e? What does 5e mean? When we talk about 5e in the world of tabletop role-playing games, I don't know that we all have a good understanding of what 5e actually means. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what 5e means, where it came from, how it's changed, and what it means for our games now. I have two goals for this video. Goal number one is if you are new to D&D, if you are new to tabletop role-playing games, and you are seeing things like something being 5e compatible or that something is 5e, what does that actually mean? What does it mean in your relationship with playing D&D or playing other tabletop role-playing games? What does that mean? And I also want to talk about it from the point of view of existing TTRPG hobbyists, those of us who have been playing this game for a while, to understand what 5e means today and how that has changed from what 5e has meant in the past. So those are the two real goals that I have for this video. And this actually came because recently the Tales of the Valiant Game Master Guide had Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide 5e. And some patrons of Sly Flourish said, what does that even mean? They were confused by the fact that it said 5e because they said, I thought this was a Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide. Is this just a general 5e Game Master's Guide? And that led to a discussion of, well, what does that even mean? Isn't Tales of the Valiant 5e? Is it a different thing than 5e? Is this for people? Can you use this with other variants of 5e? What does this all mean? So I thought this is a good example. Now, of course, the easy answer to why it says 5e on the end is search engine optimization. This is a way for Kobold Press to make sure that people find Tales of the Valiant when people aren't searching for Tales of the Valiant, but are searching for 5e. But if you dig into that a little bit, the reason why they're searching for 5e is for something in particular, which is they are interested in products that are compatible with Dungeons & Dragons and compatible with other versions of 5e. And that's kind of what 5e means now. 5e means compatible with Dungeons & Dragons, the existing version of Dungeons & Dragons, which is the 2014 version of Dungeons & Dragons. We still don't know what the 2024 version of Dungeons & Dragons is going to look like, but we're pretty sure they claim to be 5e compatible as well. But we're also going to talk today about what compatibility means, which is probably the bigger piece of this to dissect. That when something says they are 5e compatible, what can you generally expect that means when you're running it? So this video should hopefully be useful to you if you are new to D&D, if you are new to tabletop role-playing games, and you're starting to see people referring to something as either 5e or 5th edition compatible. And if you've been in this hobby for a while, I want to talk to you about how I feel like 5e has changed over the past year, but also probably for the future, and even how it's changed from what we were used to with 5e compatibility to begin with. So where did 5e originally come from? The term 5e stands for 5th edition, which means the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons in particular. That in 2014, Wizards of the Coast published the 3 Dungeons & Dragons core books, the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. And all of those are referred to as the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, if you look at the Dungeons & Dragons book, the only place where it actually says 5th edition is on the back. I have one. Where's my copy? Right over here. Right? On the back of the book, it says, when you're ready for even more, expand your adventures with the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual. Now, that's the only place that it actually references 5th edition because Wizards is not interested in reminding you that there's a whole bunch of old versions of D&D, including 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 3.5, and 4th edition, and OD&D, and the white box, and a whole bunch of other. They don't want you to really worry about that. They want you to just buy this one. This is the Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. That's what they want you to say. Now, of course, this year, they're going to have a new version of this, and they're going to say the same thing, and they're different books. So what does that mean? That's why I think this video is important. So 5th edition means 5th edition of version of D&D. But it's starting to mean something else as well. And that is because back in 2016, Wizards of the Coast released the rule set for the 5th edition of D&D in a thing known as the 5.1 System Reference Document and made it available under a license called the Open Gaming License. I am not going to get into the controversy of what happened with the Open Gaming License. There's a million videos that can talk about what happened. But for the sake of this conversation, they released those rules in the open, which meant people could write 5th edition compatible products without getting Wizards of the Coast permission, without paying a license fee to Wizards of the Coast, without having Wizards of the Coast change the agreement of the license in order to ruin the products. Again, I'm not getting into the OGL talk. There's a whole big conversation on what happened last year. That's not relevant to this conversation. So that's what 5e meant before. And that's where 5e came from. And what that meant before was that 5e compatible material was compatible with the 2014 version of Dungeons & Dragons. That's what it meant. And that's pretty much what it still means. That if you go and you see a product that claims to be 5th edition compatible, your expectation is that it is compatible with the 2014 version of Dungeons & Dragons. But that has now started to change. And it changed in particular because not only is the 5.1 system reference document available under the Open Gaming License, it is now also available under the Creative Commons license, which means that anybody can write a commercially available version of 5th edition, including the entire game system, without paying a license fee to Wizards of the Coast, without Wizards of the Coast having any kind of control over it, all that sort of stuff. So in these recent days, we've seen other publishers putting out their own full variants of 5th edition compatible role-playing games. An example is Ian Publishing's Level Up Advanced 5e, which I've spent a lot of time talking about the show. I think it's really outstanding, but they are not the only one. There's a company that made Fate Forge, a whole variant of it with its own style and its own unique take on 5e. MT Black has his Iskandar Player's Handbook, which is a complete player's handbook tuned around his own city of Iskandar, built using core 5th edition mechanics. So now we are starting to see entire sets of books that are intended to completely replace the 3 core books of the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. One that is coming out this year is Tales of the Valiant by Kobold Press. Kobold Press was one of the largest publishers of 5th edition material compatible with D&D. Last year, they kickstarted and ran, and I think this May they're coming out, the Tales of the Valiant core books, which include an Adventurer's Guide and a Monster Vault, and then they're running, as of this video, running the Kickstarter for the Game Master's Guide. Again, their own complete take of 5e. So for me, that means 5e is different now than it was, because now 5e doesn't just mean compatible with the 2014 version of D&D. It also means compatible with these other versions of 5e, and that those products are compatible with the other products of 5e. So when Tales of the Valiant says they have a 5e Game Master's Guide, when they say Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide 5e, what that means is, in theory, this Game Master's Guide will be useful whether you're wanting Level Up Advanced 5e, or the 2014 version of D&D, or theoretically the 2024 version of D&D, or Fate Forge, or whatever. And that it's going to get messy. So what does compatibility actually mean? When something claims to be 5e compatible, what does that actually mean? Well, one thing is that it's not a binary state, that something isn't 100% compatible or 0% compatible. There are degrees of compatibility depending on what kind of product you're talking about and which system you're integrating it with. There are going to be different degrees. My biggest recommendation is to hang on with a loose grip, that don't expect that everything is going to slot in absolutely perfectly, and that we as GMs are in control of our games, and we're probably going to have to finagle things a little bit, even when we're bringing in things that should be generally compatible. That said, there are some things that we can have a general expectation for full compatibility when we see something as being 5e compatible. An example is we would expect that they're using all of the core rules. They still have difficulty classes, they still do D20 checks, initiative, how combat works, the general flow of power, all of that is we can have expectation is going to be the same. The same with like character levels and what character levels means. We're probably have the same expectation across all of our games. Now, if something is changing what power level a level 12 is, that's probably not really compatible. Monsters are almost certainly compatible. In fact, monsters are probably the most crunchy bit of material that publishers have been putting out for 5e over the last 10 years. We've seen thousands and thousands of monsters, and monster books from other publishers other than Wizards of the Coast have been very, very popular over the past 10 years. So monsters, we can generally have an expectation that monsters are going to be compatible. Now, that said, the design of monsters can change over time, and the style of monster that you might see in the 2014 Monster Manual compared to even other Dungeons & Dragons books published in recent times has changed significantly. Spellcasters now operate differently than they did in 2014 than in products you might have picked up in the last couple of years. For example, they have a lot of like arcane blasts and things like that. If you look at the 2014 Monster Manual and compare it to the 2022 Monsters of the Multiverse book, how spellcasters operate is completely different. In the same way, if you look at the Level Up Advanced 5e Monstrous Menagerie and how it uses spellcasters, that is also different. However, them being different does not mean mean they are not compatible. They still all work. You just have to change how you operate your monsters when you're looking at them. But the compatibility is still there. So monsters, you can be pretty confident if somebody's writing a 5th edition compatible monster that it's going to be compatible. Doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. Doesn't mean it'll be well balanced. Doesn't mean it works right. But it does mean that, generally speaking, the publisher who put it out has an expectation that you would be playing it in a 5th edition game. And that should exist across whatever version of 5e you happen to be playing. If you're playing Level Up Advanced 5e, or you're playing Tales of the Valiant, or you're playing 2014 D&D, or you're playing 2024 D&D, any of whatever, whatever version you're playing, you should generally have an expectation that a monster is a monster is a monster. Magic items are the same way. Magic items are nice encapsulated chunks of mechanics. There'll be power variance within rarity, of course, but generally speaking, you can assume a magic item written by one publisher for 5e is compatible with pretty much all of the versions of 5e that you would be running. Same with spells. It doesn't mean that there's not lots of different spells, and some spells are overpowered and some spells are underpowered, or that spells don't operate well, or sometimes they operate really well. Generally speaking, if a book says that they are a 5th edition book full of spells, like Kobold Press's Deep Magic 1 and 2, you have an expectation that you'll be able to take those Deep Magic 1 and 2 spells and operate them in any of your 5th edition compatible games. 2014 D&D, 2024 D&D, Level Up Advanced 5e, Tales of the Valiant, Fate Forged, whatever variant you're running. Adventures. Adventures usually have so little connection to mechanics that even if they're written for a different system completely, it's usually not too hard to convert them over to whatever your tabletop role-playing game system is of choice. People have been doing this for decades. People have been taking old modules, running them with new mechanics. I did it recently using an adventure from 1983 with a role-playing game that came out in 2023, and I had no problem running the adventure with that. So generally speaking, converting adventures from one system to another isn't that hard, and if an adventure says it's 5th edition compatible, you can be pretty sure it'll work with any version of 5e that you've got, because generally adventures don't have a lot of mechanics. Same with campaigns. Campaign books usually are very loose in how they're written. They don't usually have a lot of hardened mechanics in them that are going to be difficult depending on what system of play you've got. Generally speaking, campaigns are going to work out. Conditions, another example of a mechanic. You can have an expectation that conditions in 5e are the expected conditions across other versions. However, some new ones are going to add some new conditions. For example, A5e offers a handful of other conditions, including like dazed and doomed and strife. So those conditions, if you're playing with dazed and doomed and strife, you shouldn't generally expect that you're going to find another 5e product that's going to refer to those conditions. Now, there's some stuff that's questionable with compatibility. New classes. There are definitely books that have brought in new classes. Probably those classes will work well alongside whatever classes you've got operating in whatever 5e variant you happen to be running, but you shouldn't expect a lot of cross-class stuff. For example, how do spells work? If you pick one 5e system that isn't using like the 2014 D&D spell lists and instead has its own, you shouldn't expect that some of those spells are going to end up on another class that it didn't even know about. So classes are going to be weird. Subclasses are going to be weird. Subclasses, not every variant of 5e handles subclasses the same way. Even 2014 and 2024 D&D seem to be operating differently in that there's going to be some kind of conversion required to take subclasses that were written for 2014 D&D to make them compatible 2024 D&D. So subclasses are one of those areas where you as a GM and you and your players are going to have to work to figure out how to take a subclass published in one material and apply it to the class that you have for whatever your system of choice is. Races, species, and ancestry. Recent books have gotten away from the idea of like a fixed race, like an elf and a dwarf and a halfling with just their stuff, and that their race and their ancestry and their species and their culture are bound up in one thing, and they're splitting that out. There's a book called Ancestries and Culture that's an entire 5e supplement that takes that idea of race and breaks it out into a much wider area where you can have elves that were raised by dwarves or a human that was raised by dragonborn. You can take and mix and match different traits of different species, different cultures, and put them together to really make your character more rich. Many of the more recent versions of 5e have grabbed onto this. Tales of the Valiant has grabbed onto this. Level Up Advanced 5e has grabbed onto this. And the 2024 version of D&D looks like it is also grabbing on. However, they're all doing it slightly differently, which means that if you find a race in an old book, there's not necessarily an easy way for you to understand how you're going to take that race and you're going to get it to work on whatever your version is. You're going to have to do some work there. So compatibility with race is going to be one of those areas. It might be that one, and subclasses might be the ones that you might clash with the most. Feats. Feats are being handled differently on different systems. That 2014 D&D and Level Up Advanced 5e handle feats one way. Tales of the Valiant doesn't even have feats. It has another name for feats. They're really the same thing, but they are also meatier than a feat is. And same way with 2024 D&D, the ones we have seen in the playtest right now show us that feats in 2024 D&D seem to be like the equivalent of 150% of the power of a normal feat, because they include a point bump in an ability score and a feat thing. So feats are going to be an area of compatibility that's going to be a little mucky. And then you're going to find that all of these systems have their own individual rule systems. That Level Up Advanced 5e has things like supply and safe havens for handling travel and managing rests. You have the luck system from Tales of the Valiant. You're going to find that each of these systems wants to add in some kind of thing that makes it different. The 2024 version of D&D playtests have like a Bastion system that they include in there. You shouldn't have an expectation that these new systems that these 5e variants have are going to be backward compatible with every other product. They're not going to even know about them. So stuff like that, you're going to have to decide like which of these rule sets you're going to bring in. So why does all of this matter? This is all very complicated. My general idea is to recognize that when you see a product being 5th edition compatible or 5e compatible, you have a general expectation at a loose level that that product will be compatible with whatever version of 5e you happen to be playing. Most likely that's going to be right now the 2014 version of D&D. You might just be totally happy playing with the 2014 version of D&D sitting there at your table. That's totally fine. But now you understand that what 5e means is that even if you're playing the 2014 version of D&D, some of this stuff you could bring in and it would be compatible with it. You might be doing things like adding in something like ancestries and cultures to replace race in 2014 D&D. That's a degree of 5e compatibility where you grab one product and you bring it in and modify how you run. Now, an obvious one is you might take adventures or monster books or campaign settings from other publishers and use them alongside your regular 2014 version of D&D. That's probably the most common way to broach into this idea of 5e compatibility: adventures, monster books, and campaign source books that you bring in. But then you might say, yeah, but I do want to bring in some of these subclasses too. You might have the Midgard Heroes book from Kobold Press, and you want to include some of the interesting subclasses from there because you're running in a Midgard game. Maybe you have some of the subclasses available for the Tollus RPG by Monty Cook Games. You want to bring those in. Then you could have these entire other supplements that you bring in, like Uncharted Journeys from Cubicle 7, which adds a whole new layer of how exploration can work in your 2014 version of D&D. What's really neat is you can completely replace the Dungeon Master side of 5e, and your players are still fully compatible by running the 2014 version of D&D. So if they're totally wired into D&D Beyond, enjoying their lives using D&D Beyond, that's totally cool, but you can replace everything on your side with other stuff. New monsters, new exploration challenges, new adventures, new campaign stuff, new spells, new magic items, all the different aspects that you can bring in to change everything on your side of the screen, which I think is really powerful. That idea that you can bring in hundreds of different products or pieces and parts of dozens of different products and completely change out your side of how things operate on the DM side without having to change anything on the player side is really powerful. But then you also might say, hey, we want to try something new. We really like the idea of combat maneuvers. We're unhappy with the fact that melee classes don't seem to be holding up to spellcasting classes using 2014 version of D&D. Well, then you want to try the combat maneuver system that exists in Level Up Advanced 5e. You can say, for this game, we're going to use the Level Up Advanced 5e Adventurer's Guide on the player side instead of the player's handbook. And now you've actually managed to kind of pull out the entire engine of 5e, and yet your players will totally recognize it because they're used to 5e. I hope this video was useful in helping you understand what 5e means, what 5th edition compatibility means, and how that can help you with your game. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter so that you can get a weekly RPG-related email sent directly to your inbox. You can also support me directly on Patreon, where you can get all different kinds of tools and supplements to help you run your 5e games. And you can pick up any of my books, including The Four Defoes, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and others at the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you all so much. Have a great day. Get out there and play an RPG.